I'm going to turn it over. Sorry, I should have waited for that, I guess. I'm going to turn it over to David Phillips in a moment here. But before I do, just want to remind everyone that if you're not a member of TMA Central Texas, feel free to join, check out our events. We're a pretty active and lively group, and we're always looking to add new members. And feel free to reach out to myself or Sarah Singer if you want more information regarding that. With that, I will turn it over to David Phillips, who I think will introduce our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Sarah, let's move to the next slide, if you would. We've got an upcoming event, which we will be in Central Texas. Events on the next slide. Touch on. Just a reminder to remain on mute. Here's some keyboard work. Good afternoon, everyone. David Phillips. I'm the events chairman of TMA Central Texas. I'm a member of Far West Capital. We provide invoice factoring and asset-based lending to operating companies in a variety of stages. Early stage being one, turnaround being another, fast growth being a third. Very excited for today's presentation. George Randall is one of our two panelists. He's the managing partner of Randall Partners. He's the author of a fantastic book called The Talent War. George has hired more than 83,000 individuals in his career, including 2,500 executives. Rob Dees is our other panelist. Rob is the global head of people analytics for Lowe's companies. Rob, inside of Lowe's, is the voice of the associate, which we look forward to better understanding. Both Rob and George have military backgrounds, which is part of the pursuit of them as speakers today. They bring a unique perspective based on their careers and that component of their career. Just going to start, George, with a specific question for you.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 of your book is titled, What's so wrong, with traditional hiring practices? Would you mind summarizing your observations and comments from chapter 2 and expanding upon that topic?
Well, I do want to give the caveat that I know how Rob Dees' firms work. So Rob Dees' firm is exempt from this answer. So I do want to share that. I would tell you the first thing is, that we wrote about in the Talent War that really is most companies don't have what's called a talent mindset, understanding that your products may change, your service may change, the environment, the economy, all the things that are going to change, but it's always powered by people. And so people lacking a talent mindset, understanding that the only true advantage you can hope to achieve and maintain is your talent, is the first thing. Recruiting becomes kind of a secondary function, and the HR and talent acquisition teams, are generally structured, as I say, they'll get a job description, roll it up in a ball, throw it over their shoulder, and the recruiting team is somewhat akin to ordering something off of Amazon. Here's a list of all of the objective requirements. So number one, not having a talent mindset. Number two is HR is usually structured for compliance. It's usually structured for comp and benefits, not recognizing the importance of that everybody that you bring into your company is absolutely critical to the success. And then, the last thing, that I would say is most people that are doing hiring, whatever the role is, have not defined success. And they simply look at a list of objective requirements, preferred requirements, and say, well, hey, great resume, they worked at our competitor, whatever. There's a little bit of resume seduction going on, and they bring that person over. They haven't really defined within their own culture, the team, or the role, what success looked like from an attribute perspective.
Really interesting. In your career, George, this is related to the hiring, right? You've hired, as we touched on, 83,000, but you've had some sprints in your career. You've hired 200 folks in a 100-day period, and at one point, a different situation, hired 3,000 folks in a 4-month period. How do you do that well? And obviously, it's not just you, but how does an HR team or an executive team that really needs to bring on a high volume of folks? How do you do that well?
Well, I think the reason for my success, and the reason it's 83,000, I was working at one of the world's largest companies. So these were scattered across 90 companies and a rather large team. It was not an individual effort by any stretch. But I think the thing is that made our team different is we were students of the business, and we were very much aligned to the business. And for large scale projects, our teams were embedded in the business. And as they were looking at contracts, as they were looking at expansion, as they were looking at growth, and combined with workforce planning, we got a heads up as to what was coming, meaning we were doing the absolute opposite of order taking. So we were able to structure our teams and flex our teams, reassign, and we had a term in the military, where we would pick units to perform a task force, and we pulled what we needed to make each one of those. And 200 people in 100 days with cybersecurity sales specialists. So we retrofitted, maybe not the right word. We refocused recruiters that were engineering based to support our sales team. And for the one that, was in Asia Pac and in about 5 countries to do 3,000 in that period, it was a matter of saying, okay, what's the ultimate priority here, which is our customer and our client and the team, internal and external. What does that goal look like? Back into what do we need to develop in the way of sourcing, advertising, marketing, and how do we execute on a standardized process that's as smooth as we can possibly make it, and the least bureaucratic that we can make it. Meaning many companies that I walk into have 10, 15 steps to get to an offer approval. And to do something like that, we literally made agreements to get the approval process down to 2. And then it's a matter of, just motivating the team to grind and understand that, listen, your success is what's going to make the company successful. They really had to know their why. And then you really have to be on top of the data. Are you filling a funnel? Are you qualifying? Are you really moving fast enough to make your target? Because in talent acquisition and hiring talent, when you get behind, it's almost impossible to come back from it. You have to stay ahead of the game.
You mentioned kind of that hiring funnel. I want to, with Rob here shortly, I want to ask you both at some point about, powerful questions that you've kind of honed or seen in your career to really screen and kind of identify, talent. So let's come back to that. Thank you, Rob. I want to ask you to get in on the discussion. You have a graduate degree in analytics. You specifically focused on people analytics. Tell us a little bit more about why, kind of what you knew about yourself or what you saw, in industries that resulted in you pursuing that graduate degree.
Yeah, I would. Thanks, David. As I would maybe recommend to anyone, it really kind of started from my own identity, right? I would say that first, right? Growing up, I was an athlete. I was an Army Ranger. Always on a team, right? Where the human was the machine, right? Even in the military, I was an infantry person where, it's not about making the helicopter maintenance so that it can fly. It's not about the tank. It's about the human, right? And so whether it's in sports or the military, I was just always my job, right? Essentially until I was about 30, it was how to figure out how to bring the very best out of humans, right? And I got this opportunity in the military to go back to graduate school, to be a professor at systems engineering at West Point, right? And become an analytics professional, right? And so naturally for me, my interest in people, right? And then also this, interest in analytics, right? The natural intersection is people analytics. And for me, it's the most interesting part of analytics because when we're applying this hard science to squishy people, right? In trying to figure out what we can do to, whether it's find the right people for the team, how we reward the right people on the team, how we, help people develop, from where they are right now to be the next best version of themselves, right, next year, right? Or, even who we need to let go, right? Who's taking away from the culture, I mean, so I just love that intersection. And for me, that's what led me into people analytics. And really, I mean, while I got my start really while I was a professor at West Point, the head of recruiting for the Army, the 3-star general, came to us and said, "Hey, I need to figure out how to measure the heart of a soldier." And I was like, "I'm in, right? Like, let's go, right?" And that led to the last 10 years of my time in the Army being focused on people analytics, and it was a natural transition. I mean, working at Dell Technologies or now Lowe's.
Heart of a soldier, Rob, you know, that's really interesting. Unpack that a little bit more and maybe extrapolate it to Dell and then now Lowe's. But something you posted about on LinkedIn that I've enjoyed reading was your philosophy around looking for grit, gratitude, and grace in the folks that you work with, I'm sure on your team specifically, but then the associates across Lowe's. Maybe just unpack that philosophy, how you arrived at that. Was it first personal experience and then did data come after? But give us a little bit of background on that philosophy.
Well, I mean, so first through personal experience, right? I mean, growing up, I mean, being an athlete and then also being a part of Army infantry organization, there's a whole lot of emphasis, right, on, your own personal attributes or ethics or values that you carry. And things you would bring to the table as a human, right, regardless of your specific skill set, but just as a member of a team, anywhere, right? And whether it's a family team, whether it's a work team, whether it's whatever kind of team. And so that for me, what we did in this, how to measure a heart of a soldier, it initiated something I called the whole soldier program in the Army, where we developed measures of heart, body, and mind, right? I mean, those are the 3 domains. And we would collect assessments of soldiers, in the 3 areas in heart, body, and mind, and there's a whole bunch more to it. But the entire intent was to learn how do we get the very best people. So that was to measure how well people were doing in terms of heart, body, and mind. But then the next piece was we did a long longitudinal study, like testing folks for various psychometric metrics to understand how we could predict who would be a good team member, right? Specifically, grit and gratitude, right? Those 2 personality characteristics, when we measured them in people, folks that tested in the top half on grit and top half on gratitude, it was very predictive that they'd be like a top 20% performer. It was very, very strong relationship. So regardless of the type of team, it didn't matter in the military if this was somebody that was making food in the mess hall or doing maintenance on trucks or wielding, jumping out of airplanes, right? It did not matter what type of team, but both of those things, grit and gratitude, when taken together, indicated that this person was going to be a very strong performer, right? And so then, that was one of the major outcomes of like the last 10 years of work in the Army. And then quite frankly, the COVID pandemic hit, right? And when I was at Dell Technologies leading people analytics, and I really started to think about grace, right? In addition to, gratitude. If gratitude is kind of taking inventory of how my glass is half full, right? Or looking for the best things. Grace is almost like taking inventory of how my glass is half empty, right? What do I do, right, with myself when I fall short of expectations, or what do I do with others when I fall short of it? It's like the manifestation of favor and forgiveness to myself and others, right? It's how I think about grace, right? So really that paradigm, has not only kind of been a real strong working philosophy for me to hire, folks, right? But it's also been, very useful from a predictive standpoint, specifically predicting performance in the military.
Really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Rob and George, let's kind of bounce between you and let's keep building on this topic of character and identifying, character. How do you do that George, in your role, thinking more about the C-suite and executive leaders, the chapter in your book is called Hire for Character, Train for Skills. And I know you're not, talking about taking someone off the shop floor and making them CEO of an international business. But what do you look for when you're recruiting into the C-suite or trying to find talented folks to place inside of clients of yours? What do you look for? How does character manifest itself whenever you're building relationships with candidates?
Yeah, I love Rob's, 3 points there: grit, grace, and gratitude. Really what I like to tell people to avoid resume seduction and other things is to simply say that experience tells you where you've been, character tells you where you're going. And so when it comes to executives, the first thing I want to do before I look at it in other people is try to the best of my ability to define what characteristics, what attributes define success in this particular company or this particular role. And, I use the analogy for those of you that follow pro football, and I am not intending to upset anybody's apple cart here by making a judgment. But if you take Tom Brady and put Tom Brady in the Kansas City Chiefs, Andy Reid offense, the chances are of him winning 7 Super Bowls is not likely. If you put Pat Mahomes in the Patriots when Bill Belichick was there in their system, he's not likely to do as well either. So both A players, but the environment matters. So the first thing is making sure that you're very, very clear on the environment that this executive is going to go into. Or is it a dumpster fire, that they have to put out? Is it a reconstruction, transformation? Is it a build out? Is it scale? They're all different skill sets. Plus, they require different characteristics. They require different attributes. So I want to make sure, to the best of my ability, I've defined the success attributes. And, grace is probably one that I'm looking for, but I don't have down on the list. It might be resiliency, it might be effective intelligence, emotional intelligence. If you're going through a reconstruction, the ability to have empathy on a dimmer switch, when to turn it up, when to turn it down. And so once I get that definition of success and those attributes, I'm usually looking for 4 or 5 key attributes. And I guess this is one of the things is, certainly recruiting executives, most of the people you're going to talk to have already met the table stakes of the role experientially. Mm-hmm. There's not as much variation as people think. Maybe somebody has more experience in M&A and somebody's got 1 or 2 years. But as I say, 1 year in M&A or 5 years in M&A might be 1 year in programming, 4 years of programming. It's still, those people still could be equally A players and do the job as well. Past the table stakes, I get into deep behavioral interviewing, and I will use a number of assessments. It might be Caliper, it might be Hogan. Hogan happens to be just my preferred one because I've been using it the longest time, because I want to understand what motivates them from a value standpoint, how that shows up in personality, and then what happens when they're under stress, because we all operate great, when things are going well. But in executive positions, it's the people, that can have the grit or have the resiliency and the drive and the bounce back. So I'll do a very deep behavioral interview based off what I find on the assessments I use.
On the stress point, George, how do you, is it questions or some of those assessments? How do you talk to someone about kind of a hard topic for folks to always be transparent about, is kind of them at their worst or them under, considerable amount of duress?
Yeah, there's one particular one that I will always add in. And there's kind of a formulaic interview that I'll go through. Personally, one of the first things that I will do is I will tell the candidate that I have not reviewed their resume and I have not reviewed their LinkedIn profile. And so right there, I'm generating beads of sweat off their forehead. Because they want to be talking about the successful things that they've done. What I want to do is get to know who this person is. And I have the benefit of the Hogan that I've completed. So I'm going to have a conversation and make it as conversational as I possibly can. But, one of the things that I'll look to demonstrate authenticity, and one thing that I don't think enough people interview for and they take for granted, is integrity. And so one of the key questions, and there are many of them, but one of the ones that I like to is tell me a time when you missed a KPI, you missed a quarterly goal, you missed some major milestone, product milestone, development milestone, and you had to report it to your boss, and you knew full well that there would be adverse consequences to your career and possibly to your team, but you had to stand up and own it. I want you to walk me through your thought process. Tell me about it. And believe it or not, it's so easy to tell when somebody's tap dancing on that one and making that one up. And, because I want to see that they failed. I want to see the authenticity. I want to see the integrity. And I want to see the resiliency. And I can usually get quite a bit out of just that one simple question.
That's great. Rob, in your career, I imagine you see character, firsthand as a leader in your time in the Army. But how do you do? And obviously now at Lowe's, you have a core team that you'll interview and work closely with. But thinking about how you do it at scale, right? I mean, because you're not meeting every associate at Lowe's. How do you implement the gratitude, grace, or the looking for character when you're so far away from sitting down with the person?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is something that George just highlighted is assessments can be done at scale, right? And obviously they aren't free, right? I mean, each one of these things you would potentially invest in, right? But then, I mean, beyond assessments, right? There can be, even within a company my size, say we've got over 35,000 managers that hire people, right? So, there can be, governance of like, how do we do this process, right? What are the things that we're looking for? Have we identified the core behaviors? How would we learn about them in candidates? Much like George would take this, it's almost like conversations at scale, right? So what George just said about having an individual conversation, not only can we do assessments at scale, but we have conversations or interviews at scale. And at a Lowe's store, a manager may have 15 minutes, right? It may be spring and we've got a lot of mulch that we're going to have to sell and carry to people's cars, right? Or whatever. They may have 15 minutes and I saw the name of the book behind George here, Sizing People Up, right? 15 minutes to size this person up before they've got to do whatever else, or they got the next candidate coming in. And some of these hiring managers are hiring dozens of people in a week, right? We at scale, what we can do is train them, right? Essentially to go through the interview process to size people up as quickly as possible. But then also coming back to, we can learn, right? There's this whole world of machine learning and AI, right? We can also measure, right? Post-mortem, right? The quality of our hires, right? And then, allow ourselves to learn from that. By using big data to say, hey, store managers, for instance, for Lowe's, we've learned that, if folks demonstrate this in the hiring process, or they have these attributes, right, that they are exhibiting on average, a higher quality of hire over time, or they either do better work, but they provide quality, or they provide quantity. They stay with us longer, right? And so particularly in the retail industry, that there's trade-offs there, right? How long do they stay, right? How, as a matter of prediction, versus how well do they serve while they're here, right? And so oftentimes we're coaching folks about the quantity and quality trade-off. To inform their conversations along with the assessments that we do at scale.
Yeah, David, I wanted to add on to that, because what Rob's talking about is something that companies don't do, and it's the feedback loop and measure how well you did on the quality of hiring. And Rob and I had the distinct privilege of what I call growing up in the world's greatest leadership incubator. And so we were always evaluated. There was always a feedback loop on how we were assessed in our jobs. And that was a continual process. And what Rob is doing there at Lowe's is something that I tell you, I rarely see, and it pays huge dividends.
That's That's really interesting. And yeah, that sort of effort doesn't have to just be at a huge organization. There can be just I would imagine just meetings with executives whenever there's not a fit, right? And some reflection on what did we learn, or even reflection on the longest tenured, kind of your top folks in your organization. Kind of what are we seeing? What patterns are we seeing?
And I would say that, I mean, David, regardless of the size of the organization, that type of post-mortem, whether it's a post-mortem because something went poorly, or it is like actually a part of your performance measurement system, right? I mean, how you structure your performance measurement system, it will collect data at scale about how well people are doing, right? That should, exactly as George highlighted, provide that feedback into quality of hire. And so I would say that, I mean, there needs to be early assessment after a hire. I mean, many companies have like these annual performance reviews, things along those lines. It's too long, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm an advocate. I mean, and this is just Rob talking. I'm not saying we pull this off perfectly, right? But I'm an advocate for continuous listening to our associates, right? Right. But also, I mean, continuous assessment of our associates, right? And that this whole annual performance review thing is just not enough, right? It's oftentimes archaic. It's oftentimes clunky, right? Can we move it to real time, not only mentoring, performance feedback, coaching, right, but also entry of data into a system of record so that the company can understand, right, and gain insights that would help us to hire even better folks in the future, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if it is a postmortem, something went poorly, well, can you standardize how you do postmortems and get that data in one place, right? Because then you can actually learn, right? It's not just one story, I mean, an N of one, but it's 50 stories or 1,000 stories or however that. So I would just highlight the governance piece of that. Like, what are our routines to do this well, right? And capture the data so that we can learn, right? Whether it's machine learning or human learning, like, don't care, right? But it's all the same thing.
That's really good. Just a reminder, folks participating, please, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So please shoot me a message with questions as they come up, and we'll kind of weave them in. Rob and George, let's talk about transitioning well, right? Because you both have transitioned out of the military at earlier points in your career. But I would imagine, you have advice or perspective on folks in transitions. And so part of my thought process is obviously military folks transitioning, but there's a lot more fluidity in a career, now versus 50 years ago. And folks will push into a new industry or really want to try something drastically different. And that can be overwhelming and stressful. So thinking about advice for that, and then related advice for folks, there's plenty of folks that are full-time at home right now, kind of, raising young children, and then are going to be re-entering the workforce. So just a pocket of discussion on, coaching or advice you have for folks going through a transition on what that individual can do to really, have a lot of success as they pursue a second career or re-enter the workforce.
Rob, you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it. I can tag team. That's cool.
So, I would tell you one of the things that the biggest mistakes in interviewing really answers this question. And I was very, very fortunate to build veterans programs at a number of firms just because it had to be easier than when I went through. I think I did my first resume on a Brother typewriter, although that's just scary to admit. But when you look at a resume, those are objective assets. Those are accomplishments. Those are very clear things that you've done, been responsible for, and achieved something with. And most of the people, whether they're entering the workforce or they're transitioning, have that on their resume, and they have this laundry list. But beside that, there are the subjective assets, how they were able to accomplish those. And I call that the biggest mistake, is that most people don't know themselves well enough, let alone how to articulate it. It's one thing to have driven sales to 150% of your quota, but how did you do it? Number one, what was it about you where your predecessor couldn't do it? and the person after you couldn't do it. And how did you do that? What were those attributes? What were those traits? What were those things that you did differently? And then teach them or practice how to articulate those. For me, if you're transitioning or you're interviewing for the first time or any new job, I would tell you, when I get off script and I have to ask people about themselves, you would think that people could describe themselves or their leadership style very easily, but they've never sat down to know themselves and take a personal inventory. So transitioning, interviewing, for me, it's the same thing. Know yourself and know how to articulate it. That gives color and context to the objective accomplishments that you've listed.
Yeah.
I would tackle on there. So, I mean, for folks on the line, my particular academic interest in the area of analytics is decision science, like prescriptive decision science. How would we make decisions, right? Either as a decision consultant, or how would I consult myself in my own decision making, right? And I mean, the thing that I would say first to anybody out there when making any decision is to have, I mean, practice this value-focused thinking. Like, clearly, what are the objectives, right? And I mean, how would we measure the accomplishment of the objectives? And as we think more about lower level objectives, we will arrive at alternatives that may be possible, right? And so in this, I mean, I would advise the same thing, maybe worded differently for folks making a transition. Focus first on your aspirational identity, who you are and who you want to be, right? I mean, for me, and I think that not only applies to choosing a job, but I think it applies to many, many choices in life. I mean, I used to teach in my decision-making class, like, hey, here's a litmus test for all of you. If you don't know what to do, like, ask yourself 2 questions to get you headed in the right direction. One is, what do you want to be able to say when you die? And who do you want to be able to say it to, right? And those 2 questions, right, could oftentimes guide you. But for me, really thinking about my objectives in life, I'll just be transparent with the group here. I mean, I've thought very, very deeply about this, and it means a lot to me. I am strong, I am loving, and I'm free, right? And I aim to carry that into every situation that I go into, right? And so when I mean, and that's been related to, I mean, selection of people analytics. It's, I mean, wanting to be a leader in this field, all those types of things. But I would ask you to think about, like, what is your unique, right, identity, and think about the objectives that you have for your life, right? I mean, who you want to be, what you want to say, and who you want to say it to, right? And that will probably help to drive and frame the objectives for all career decision making, right? And transition from one career to the next, or the next job from this one, or not having a job into a job, right? I mean, and that is specifically how I evaluate offers of jobs, right? Hey, there's measures of compensation and what that provides, right? I mean, versus level of flexibility. I mean, I've got a 2-year-old son. I work remotely. I very, very highly value that I can walk in for 15 minutes when I have a break and see my 2-year-old son, right? Somebody would have to pay me extraordinarily more for me to give up that 15-minute break, I mean, during the day, to go see my 2-year-old, right? But it all starts with this notion of values and what's important to you. And as you really clearly think about that, it will enable you to come up with creative solutions, see opportunities that maybe you hadn't seen before. And obviously, you got to blend that with your skills and what are my unique talent, skills, abilities, things along those lines. But I mean, kind of as George has highlighted, I would start with your very own identity, and trying to figure out who you are and who you want to be, right? As the first step. I see many people jump immediately to the alternatives. They'll immediately go to a job board, right? And say, hey, there's all these alternatives. Like, I mean, apply to all of them, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I had a great example from, I mean, my own son. I mean, one of my sons, he's a college student right now. And he was going to his first job fair, right? And there was 500 companies showing up at this job fair. And he basically did a profile and narrowed it down to 3 that he thought that he might like to potentially work at these places someday, right? By thinking about his objectives, right? And so instead of being the typical college job fair like attendee, like walking around getting all the freebies and the junk, right? He was like, I'm not talking to anyone. I know exactly where I'm going. I'm going these three places, and I'm having targeted conversations. I'm prepared for them, right? And so just, again, coming back to thinking about your objectives up front instead of like all the alternatives that you could, right, will help you arrive at alternatives where you're going to focus your energies. So that would be I'll shut up now, but that's my little diatribe for the moment.
Well, the paradox of choice is really, really weird. Really is real, and paralysis by analysis. That's really powerful, Rob, to kind of look inside to begin to move forward. George, anything to add before we kind of change topic there on transitioning and kind of that self-knowledge piece?
One of the things that I've shared with people and I put up in the speeches is, if I were to go to the grocery store without a list, I'm telling you, I don't know how it happens. Double stuffed Oreos, Bluebell ice cream, all the crap that I don't need ends up in my cart.
Yeah.
So if you're going into the transition, if you're going into a new career field, if you're interviewing for a new job, and you haven't defined, to Rob's point, what success looks like, what your identity is, and you don't know yourself, it's like going to the grocery store without a list. You may very well get something that's good for you in the short term, but terrible in the long term. So that's how I just remind people: define what success looks like for you, define who you are.
Yeah, just sorry, David. I would just capitalize on that's not just a transition decision. That's any decision, right? Like, yeah. We just had this conversation with. I'll talk again about my own kids. 17-year-old daughter. Write down. Out in the dating world, right? Write down start writing down right now. A list of things that you would look for or want in somebody that you ended up deciding to marry someday, right? Instead of walking blindly into who gives you attention, like at a job fair, right? It's like all of these things, right? You can be intentional about your objectives, or you can walk into the grocery store, end up with the Bluebell, and oh by the way, all of a sudden we end up with New Year's resolutions because I'm 30 pounds overweight, right? You can either be proactive, thinking about your objectives, right? And having the list, right? Going in, thinking about this, or you can just let the world present you alternatives and end up someplace you don't want.
Yeah.
Great. That's really, really powerful. Just a reminder about the Q&A. We'll transition there soon. But part of the intent in the discussion today, George and Rob, is about retention, right? Thinking about, I think there's a really powerful, point of discussion around culture, keeping a culture strong. But how do you, thinking about training and mentoring, like, what do you see, George, in the best organizations you consult with about what they do culturally to almost take retaining kind of off the table? Folks are so kind of bought in and kind of enjoying the work they do, who they work with. What's the profile of that organization that really has that figured out?
In short, simple terms, for me, the first and foremost thing is that the leadership of the company and all the levels down are modeling the values and the behaviors and the attributes that they hold dear and hold important. That your leaders are, number one, walking the talk. They're not just something posted up on the wall. Second of all is that they're investing in their people. Rob mentioned earlier, once we do that feedback loop, once we're looking at people in their careers, where can we invest? How do we mentor? How do we coach? How do we make people better? And investing anything over time. I think it was Henry Ford that said, somebody came to him and said, what if we invest in our people and they leave? And his retort was, what if we don't invest in them and they stay? And so I think the people that make for the strongest cultures where they're taking retention off the table is they're modeling the great leadership behaviors, and we've mentioned a number of them. They're investing in their people. And then, I just given a talk and I was talking to the leadership group and I said, the simple metric for you to get up in the morning, or a simple question to ask, is look in the mirror and say, am I the boss that I would work for? And if you can answer that in the positive, then your chances of retaining, your people and holding on to good people, and there's going to be some great people that you lose and are going to move on because they're just moving at a faster pace than your company may have slots for. But that's okay, because those people will come back around and they will be new connections. They will be new customers. They will be new clients. But invest in your people, model the behaviors, and be the boss that you would work for. The three biggest things that I tell people to do.
Yeah, I think as a people analytics leader, I would kind of specifically highlight one thing, right? And I mean, again, this is Rob Dees talking. That's not saying that my company or any company does this perfectly, right? But it's quite frankly, I mean, we're talking about investing. I mean, George, you're talking about investing in your people. And so how do they make human capital investment decisions, right? And oh, by the way, how sophisticated are they in the way that they listen to their own associates to make data-driven human capital investment decisions, right? So, for instance, I mean, hey, I mean, let's say we got $10 million in the kitty to make a human capital investment decision. Should I put that in additional learning? Should I put it in like more time off? Should I put it into pay? Should I make investments to provide schedule flexibility for people, right? What is it, right? I mean, how would we get that? I mean, from as a business person, right? What investment of that $10 million would, gain the biggest ROI, for and with our associates, right? And if you don't have a very sophisticated listening practice, right? Many companies pay little attention, but the companies that listen to their own associates as much as they listen to their customers will end up being the companies that retain people, right? And so I specifically would, if I'm looking at, talking about who will be able to retain people or have the information to retain people or know where to invest, those are the companies that are listening well to their own associates or employees. Sorry, we call it associates in retail, right? So I would look specifically at that practice if you want to know who's going to be able to retain people.
Great. Well, we have time for a few questions, so fire them over. But my question as we transition to Q&A, Rob and George, is what have we not touched on? What is something in your work, in your personal philosophy about hiring, retaining, coaching? What is something that we have not touched on, or maybe just barely touched on, you want to expand upon? George, anything come to mind?
I think we've really covered a lot. For me, because there's a lot of leaders on this call. There was this thing called Project Oxygen that Google did, years ago. And they were, determining when we talk about retention. And surprisingly, technical skills came in 8th place. And being a good coach and investing your time in your people as a leader was the number one thing that, I know that we haven't covered. So when we invest, like Rob says, where we invest money, if you've got the money to invest, how do you make a data-driven decision? By listening to your employees. But the other thing is, give of your time. I know of all of the things in the military, my successes there and now are because people and great leaders had the ungodly patience to put up with somebody like me as a young officer and invest their time and their wisdom in my development. Thank God they did. But investing your time in people always pays big dividends.
I'll jump on that with you, George. So, I know in some of our early military training, for me, they talked about like, hey, you can't be too close to your subordinates, right? You have to maintain this distance as a leader. And to an extent, to to an extent, there's some merit in that, right? I mean, you have to remain objective in your decision making. My personal philosophy on leadership has been almost exactly opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to love these people as well as I humanly know how to, right? I mean, I want to be able to recognize when they're carrying a little bit added stress from home when they walk in on a Tuesday. I want to, I don't know. I mean, I had an hour-long one-on-one with somebody that works for me yesterday. The planned discussion topic was like, talk to me about your in-progress portfolio, what's in the backlog, where you need decisions from me. And it ended up being a discussion of like, not doing real well with something in life, having a challenge, right? And I was like, all right, agenda's gone. Let's talk. What's up, right? And I've just seen over and over and over again that the work will be there. And oh, by the way, your people will run through a brick wall for you if they know that you love them. I mean, and it's truly like, as a leader, are you selfish and about self-preservation or growing your own empire, or are you unselfish? And do you show up to give? And whether it's tough love or whether it's hard love, soft love or hard love, right? Are you loving them well? It is like the central question for me as a leader. Just to put a different lens on the same thing George was saying.
Yeah.
Great. Q&A from a member, from a participant today, and this is a little closer to Rob's world. And Rob, we don't ask you to speak for your organization, speak for yourself, but there's a question from someone who's doing a lot of hiring in short bursts, right? Give me more of a tactical question. How do you look for grit and gratitude, whenever you've got to bring on 4 or 5 folks, highly seasonal business, maybe just have 15, 20 minutes with a candidate before you have to make a decision?
Yeah, very tactically. Very, very tactically. You can go out there and Google. There are 2 short assessments, both 6 questions each. Angela Duckworth was the author of that grit book, right? There is a long form measurement for grit and a short term measurement for grit, and there's a 6 question assessment out there as well on gratitude. But even if you use those questions, right, to inform your interview questions, right, even if it's not like this data-driven psychometric assessment, right, within the next 15 minutes, you could have like, hey, here's some questions I might be able to ask that get after, like, is this person possess grit and or gratitude, right? And for me, I also look for things, not necessarily, I ask them about their background. Okay, like, I got your resume, cool. Tell me about, much like George highlighted earlier, tell me about like your life. I look at my current team right now. Like, I always look for somebody that has overcome something difficult. Like whether they were, an alcoholic that overcame this and are like dead set on living a different life. That's something difficult. Whether they went through a difficult family circumstance, whether they went through a difficult thing, in a military sense in wartime, or like, and so I want to know like what people do, right? Much like George highlighted earlier, when the stress hits, what does your dummy version of you look like, right? It's like, there are psychological measurements for that would talk about that. But if you're just structuring interviews, those are maybe a couple places to look.
Really good. Great. Piggybacking some authors that have done a bunch of research is a great suggestion, Rob. Thank you. And then kind of synthesizing down a question. I'm just scanning it now. Thank you, Jason, for it. And it's about remote work. George and Rob, it's, distributed or remote, is really kind of here to stay, but it has drawbacks. I think folks can feel isolated, right? Disconnected from teams. There's even we've all experienced, that everybody works harder when folks around you are working harder, So what are you looking for specifically to help identify and hire folks that are really built to do distributed, to do remote? Is there anything that you've seen that you really need to look a little closer for to make sure is there, thinking about a role that's distributed?
Rob, you want to go first? I don't know how much remote work you have. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so I'm remote. I guess I work in Texas for a company in North Carolina. Go there. For about a week a month right now is the current rhythm. I was remote at Dell Technologies before this. I've seen remote work even before the pandemic work very, very, very well, right? I'm a believer that it can actually be more productive than in-person work, but that there is a necessary in-person component or some level of travel for folks to interact and know each other, right? From time to time, or on rhythms to consider strategy or the next 6 months or things along. There needs to be a rhythm for in-person collaboration, right? Now, and connection. Just the ability to go out and have dinner together or whatever, or in any type of team building type of activity. So, but the question I think was specifically about what I would look for if someone was going to be a remote worker. One, as a leader of a remote organization, I become less tolerant very quickly if I sense that somebody is using their liberty too freely and they have stopped becoming a proactive, engaged member of the team looking to contribute to efforts and to others, right? And so for me, it comes back to where we started, right? It comes back to integrity, character. Is this person, somebody that's fighting to deliver value to the team that they're on or not, right? Essentially remote work requires trust, right? And if you're going to have trust there, that would be, correspondent with the level of integrity, but of the person that, or values or character of the person that you're hiring, right? And so, in terms of advocating for, things like flexibility in the workplace, right? I would encourage folks to measure productivity. Take a real look at it from the data. By the way, look at how do you get the very best people? Oftentimes by allowing remote work, instead of getting applicants from one city, you get applicants from everywhere. And it's no surprise that statistics out there on LinkedIn, all this. I think it was a year ago, LinkedIn put out, I'm not going to talk about my own company data, but LinkedIn put a study out a year ago where it was like, hey, remote jobs are 20% of those posted, yet they're getting over half of all applicants, right? So if you think about talent as, a critical, most important resource to a company, right? Who knows who you're going to find and, that lives somewhere in the cornfields of Iowa that's not close to a major city that happens to be a data nerd, right? Who knows, right? So I based on, and I also know from being remote myself, I kind of look at my own productivity, and man, I need to be productive in building relationships for my team and extending my influence across the company, right? But there's also a whole lot of work to do to be able to show up with value, right? So for me, this mix of some in person, some gaining some of the intangible things from being in person, but then also going back to my whole here, and jamming, right, with my team. I don't know. So I think those are some of my thoughts on remoteness, how you might look for somebody, and how you might do it well. So George, over to you, man.
Yeah. So I think, I divide generally my questions into two categories. One for individual contributors, because I want to ask very direct questions on how they do things. How do you organize your day? How do you start your day? How do you plan for the week out? How do you close the week out? I start asking for, how they use Outlook or how they use Google Now, how they use their calendar. When I get into leadership, I'm asking, how do you stay connected? Because Rob's definitely spot on. I'm a huge believer there's a great benefit in breaking bread and being with people. And we don't want to lose the human connection, and we want to foster it. But to his point, yeah, how do you find a data nerd? People, some of the executives I have to hire remote, now they're locked into a location. But I asked them, talk to me, walk me through a situation where you've had to have a difficult conversation with an employee via Zoom where you couldn't get there. An immediate conversation was needed. Tell me about the situation, walk through those things. And so I want to ask how they organize their day, how they stay productive, how they're investing, coaching, and mentoring people. And one of the times I've asked a simple question, I said, when you're investing in people or working with people or coordinating with people, what's the balance? If you have to give me a percentage of Zoom team calls versus emails that you send to people, what's the ratio? Mm-hmm. And I don't think people think about it. And so I'm just trying to get that natural reaction for an unexpected question out of them to determine. Mm-hmm. But mind you, let me digress a bit. I do coach companies to make sure that you look very carefully at what can be a flex worker, what can be a remote worker, and what needs to be an on-premises worker. And make sure that you do that with some data, as Rob said earlier, listening to your employees. What does that workforce shape like, and what is the remote percentage? And then have a particular script that you're going for and looking for those traits when you are going to allow somebody to be remote.
It's been phenomenal. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, George. I'm going to encourage everyone to, as we're wrapping right now, get on LinkedIn, George Randall, Rob Dees. I would strongly recommend connecting with them both and following with them both. Both put out some really thoughtful content. And frankly, this has been, incredibly beneficial to me personally. And I hope everyone can kind of feel that same level of gratitude for their expert perspective. So with that, we will wrap. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, George. This has been TMA Central Texas talking about retaining, recruiting elite talent. So everyone have a great day. Rob, George, again, thank you.
Thank you guys so much. An honor.